We hunted them from the sky. One by one, they disappeared beneath the waves. The sun had barely crested the horizon when our squadron lifted off from the carrier deck that morning in late 1944, the salt spray from Manila Bay still clinging to our wings as we climbed into the dawn patrol. Below us, the Philippine waters stretched endlessly in every direction, deceptively peaceful in the golden morning light. But we knew better. Somewhere in those waters, Japanese convoys were making their desperate runs, trying to supply their crumbling positions across the archipelago before MacArthur's forces could complete their stranglehold on the islands. I was flying an F6F Hellcat that day, leading a flight of 4 aircraft on what had become our daily bread and butter, convoy interdiction missions over the Visayas. Lieutenant Commander Morrison had briefed us just 30 minutes earlier, his weathered face grave as he pointed to the intelligence photos spread across the ready room table. Gentlemen, photo reconnaissance spotted a convoy of at least 8 vessels making way through the Sibuyan Sea, heading northeast toward Manila. They're running supplies to Luzon, and we're going to make sure they don't make it. The photos showed the telltale wakes of ships in formation, their black smoke trails visible even from 20,000 feet. It was going to be a good hunting day. As we crossed over Mindoro Island, my wingman, Ensign Tommy Rodriguez from San Antonio, keyed his radio. "Skipper, I've got visual on smoke, bearing 040, about 15 miles out." I banked left and followed his heading, scanning the horizon until I caught sight of what he'd spotted, thin black columns rising from the sea like funeral pyres. The Japanese were burning coal and oil with the desperation of men who knew they were running out of time, pushing their engines beyond safe limits to try to outrun the inevitable. "Tally-ho," I called over the radio as the convoy came into full view. 8 ships in a loose diamond formation, with what looked like 2 destroyers running escort on the flanks. The largest vessel, probably a converted merchant cruiser, held the center position, while smaller cargo ships and what appeared to be a tanker made up the rest of the formation. They were making good speed, maybe 14 knots, leaving long white wakes that pointed like arrows toward their destination. But they wouldn't be reaching any destination today. We had altitude and the sun at our backs, every pilot's dream scenario. I signaled for the attack formation and pushed the Hellcat's nose down, feeling the familiar surge of acceleration as gravity took hold. The convoy was about 3 miles out when they spotted us and began their evasive maneuvers, but it was too late. At 300 knots in a shallow dive, we closed the distance in seconds, and I had the lead destroyer lined up in my gun sight like a textbook training run. The 6 .50 caliber machine guns in my wings opened up with their distinctive roar, the tracers streaming down toward the destroyer's superstructure in a deadly accurate cone of fire. I could see the impact sparkling along the ship's deck, and then Rodriguez was on my wing, adding his firepower to mine. The destroyer's anti-aircraft guns were trying to track us, but we were moving too fast and changing angle too rapidly for their gunners to get a solid solution. On my second strafing run, I switched targets to the merchant cruiser, diving down from 8,000 feet with the throttle firewall forward. The ship was enormous from that angle, filling my entire windscreen as I bored in. At point-blank range, I could see individual sailors running for cover on the deck, their white uniforms stark against the gray paint of the ship. The machine guns chattered again, and I watched my rounds stitch a line of destruction from bow to stern, setting fires wherever they struck. Pieces of superstructure flew through the air, and secondary explosions began blooming along the ship's length as my bullets found fuel lines and ammunition storage. But it was Rodriguez who scored the first kill of the day. On his third pass at the tanker, he managed to put a sustained burst into the vessel's cargo holds, and the result was spectacular. The entire ship disappeared in a towering column of orange flame and black smoke that rose nearly 1,000 feet into the air. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but scattered debris and an oil slick spreading across the blue water. "Splash one tanker," Rodriguez called over the radio, his voice cracking with excitement. It was his first confirmed ship kill, and I could hear the grin in his transmission. The convoy was in complete disarray now, the remaining ships breaking formation and scattering in all directions like startled fish. But there was nowhere to run in the open ocean, and we had plenty of fuel and ammunition left. I reformed the flight and assigned targets, coordinating our attacks to maximize damage and prevent any of the ships from escaping. Lieutenant Baker took the smaller cargo vessel on the eastern edge of the formation, while I went after one of the destroyers that was trying to lay down covering fire for the merchant ships. The destroyer captain was good. He was throwing his ship into violent evasive turns and putting up a curtain of flak that made my approaches challenging. But destroyers, for all their speed and maneuverability, were still just thin-skinned warships, and the Hellcat's guns were more than adequate for the job. I came in low and fast from the stern quarter, where his main armament couldn't bear on me, and walked my fire forward along the ship's length. I could see the bridge superstructure disintegrating under the hammer blows of the 50 caliber rounds, and then a lucky hit found something vital because the destroyer suddenly slewed to port and began losing way. My third pass was the killing blow. The destroyer was already listing badly to starboard and trailing smoke from multiple fires when I put another long burst into her engine room area. The ship shuddered, rolled over onto her beam ends, and slipped beneath the waves with surprising speed. One moment she was there, a recognizable warship fighting for her life, and the next there was only a spreading circle of debris and oil marking her grave. The entire sequence from first hit to final sinking took less than 10 minutes. Lieutenant Baker was having his own success with the cargo ship. The smaller vessel was trying to make a run for the nearest island, but she was too slow and too lightly armed to escape. Baker methodically worked her over with repeated strafing runs, starting fires throughout the superstructure and gradually reducing the ship to a floating wreck. When she finally went down, she did so slowly and with dignity, settling by the stern until the waters closed over her funnel with a final hiss of steam. By noon, 6 of the 8 ships in the convoy were on the bottom, and the remaining 2 were burning hulks that wouldn't last much longer. We circled overhead like vultures, photographing the wreckage for the intelligence boys and making sure none of the Japanese sailors were attempting to salvage anything useful from the debris fields. The water was covered with oil slicks that reflected sunlight in rainbow patterns, and scattered lifeboats dotted the area like confetti. Some of the Japanese survivors were waving white flags or pieces of clothing, but we had our orders about rescue operations. That was a job for submarines or PT boats, if they had the time and inclination. The flight back to the carrier gave us time to reflect on what we'd accomplished. In less than 2 hours of combat, we'd eliminated an entire enemy convoy and prevented those supplies from reaching Japanese forces on Luzon. It was efficient, professional work, the kind of methodical destruction that was gradually strangling the Japanese war effort throughout the Pacific. Every ship we sank meant fewer bullets for Japanese soldiers, less fuel for their aircraft, fewer medical supplies for their wounded. We were fighting a war of attrition, and we were winning it one convoy at a time. But the real satisfaction came 3 days later when we received confirmation from naval intelligence that our convoy attack had been even more successful than we'd realized. Photo reconnaissance flights over the target area had confirmed 8 separate ship sinkings, including what intelligence now identified as a converted seaplane tender that had been carrying aviation fuel and spare parts for Japanese naval air units. The loss of that particular vessel had apparently forced the cancellation of several planned air operations in the Manila area. The weeks that followed brought a steady procession of similar missions, each one adding to our growing tally of enemy vessels sent to the bottom. The Japanese were getting increasingly desperate in their attempts to supply their isolated garrisons, and that desperation was making them predictable. They were forced to run air convoys during daylight hours because they didn't have enough escort vessels to provide adequate night protection, and that made them sitting ducks for our daily patrols. One morning in early December, we intercepted what intelligence classified as a Tokyo Express run. a high-speed convoy of 3 destroyers and 2 cruisers attempting to dash supplies to Manila under cover of a weather front. The Japanese had timed their run perfectly, taking advantage of a low-pressure system that had moved in from the South China Sea and was providing excellent cloud cover. But they hadn't counted on our radar-equipped night fighters, and by the time we made visual contact at dawn, they were trapped in the open water with nowhere to hide. The engagement that followed was one of the most intense of my combat career. The Japanese warships had real teeth. Their anti-aircraft batteries could put up a solid wall of steel, and their captains were experienced enough to coordinate their defensive fire effectively. My first approach on the lead cruiser was met with such a volume of flak that I had to break off and seek another angle of attack. The sky around my aircraft was filled with black puffs of smoke and the red streaks of tracer fire, and I could hear fragments hitting me wings and fuselage. But we had numbers on our side, 12 Hellcats in 3 flights, all converging on the Japanese formation from different directions simultaneously. No matter how good their gunners were, they couldn't track that many targets at once. I came in from the northeast while Lieutenant Commander Peterson's flight attacked from the south, and the crossfire pattern we created overwhelmed their defenses completely. The lead cruiser was the first to take significant damage. Peterson put a sustained burst into her forward superstructure that started a fire among the anti-aircraft gun positions, and then Rodriguez followed up with an attack that knocked out her main fire control director. With their defensive coordination disrupted, the rest of the formation became vulnerable to our follow-up attacks. I concentrated on the trailing destroyer, a sleek, modern vessel that was trying to provide anti-aircraft cover for the larger ships. The destroyer captain was attempting to position his ship between our attacking aircraft and the cruisers, and he was doing a credible job of it until I managed to get in close enough to put some .50 caliber rounds into his forward engine room. The ship immediately began trailing black smoke and losing speed, which made her an easier target for the rest of my flight. The kill shot came from an unexpected source, Ensign Williams, our newest pilot, who had been hanging back during the initial phases of the attack. As the destroyer slowed and became increasingly unmanageable, Williams dove down from 12,000 feet and put a perfect burst right into the ship's magazines. The explosion was tremendous, a sheet of white flame that shot hundreds of feet into the air and completely vaporized the destroyer's forward half. When the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but the stern section, which rolled over and sank within minutes. The surviving cruiser and destroyer were still fighting hard, but their situation was hopeless. We had them outnumbered and outgunned, and our tactics were gradually wearing down their defenses. The second cruiser took a series of hits that started multiple fires throughout her superstructure, and although she remained afloat, she was clearly in distress. The last destroyer was trying to make a run for it, heading northeast toward Luzon at maximum speed, but she was trailing oil and down by the bow from previous damage. I coordinated the final attacks to ensure that none of the Japanese vessels could escape to fight another day. The damaged cruiser went down after Rodriguez and Williams made a coordinated attack on her engine spaces, their combined firepower proving too much for the ship's damage control efforts. She listed heavily to port, rolled over with her screws still turning, and disappeared beneath the waves with a finality that never failed to impress me. One moment there was a massive warship displacing thousands of tons, and the next there was only disturbed water and floating debris. The last destroyer proved to be the most challenging target of the engagement. Her captain was clearly an experienced officer who understood his ship's capabilities, and he was using every trick in the book to avoid our attacks. He was making radical course changes every 30 seconds, throwing up a continuous barrage of anti-aircraft fire, and even laying down smoke to obscure our targeting. But good seamanship could only do so much against determined air attack, and we had time and fuel to spare. The breakthrough came when Lieutenant Baker managed to knock out the destroyer's radar director with a lucky shot that took off the top of her main mast. With their fire control coordination disrupted, the The ship's anti-aircraft fire became much less accurate, and we were able to press home our attacks with greater effectiveness. I put several bursts into her amidships area that started fires and caused visible structural damage, and then Peterson finished the job with a low-level attack that caught the destroyer while she was turning and unable to bring her guns to bear. The final moment was almost anticlimactic. The destroyer simply stopped fighting, her guns falling silent as fires spread throughout her superstructure. She settled gradually by the stern, her crew abandoning ship in an orderly fashion that spoke well of their training and discipline. As she slipped beneath the surface, I found myself feeling a moment of professional respect for her captain and crew. They had fought their ship well against impossible odds. The intelligence debriefing back on the carrier revealed that we had just eliminated one of the most important Japanese supply runs of the entire campaign. The convoy had been carrying ammunition and spare parts that were desperately needed by Japanese air units in the Manila area, and its destruction had effectively grounded several squadrons that were already operating on minimum supplies. More importantly, from a strategic standpoint, the loss of those two cruisers represented a significant reduction in Japanese naval capability in Philippine waters. As the months passed and our convoy interdiction missions continued, the pattern became clear to everyone involved in the campaign. The Japanese were gradually running out of ships, and the ones they had left were increasingly unable to get through our air patrols. By January 1945, enemy supply runs had become so infrequent that we were spending most of our time on close air support missions for MacArthur's ground forces rather than hunting convoys. But there were still occasional opportunities for ship killing, and when they came, we made the most of them. One of the most memorable engagements occurred in late January when a Japanese hospital ship attempted to evacuate wounded personnel from Luzon. The ship was clearly marked with red crosses and was technically protected under international law, but intelligence had reliable information that she was also carrying military supplies and personnel, a violation that made her a legitimate target. The attack on the hospital ship was particularly difficult from a moral standpoint, but war rarely offers clean choices. The ship was indeed carrying wounded Japanese soldiers, but she was also loaded with ammunition and fuel that would have been used against American forces if allowed to reach its destination. After consultation with higher authority, we received clearance to attack, but with specific instructions to give the crew time to abandon ship before delivering the killing blow. I made several low passes over the vessel, waggling my wings and firing warning bursts to make our intentions clear. The Japanese crew responded quickly and professionally, lowering lifeboats and beginning an orderly evacuation. When it became clear that they were making a genuine effort to abandon ship, I pulled back and waited for confirmation that all personnel were clear before beginning the actual attack. The hospital ship went down quickly once we began our strafing runs. She was lightly built and had no armor protection, so our 50 caliber rounds easily penetrated her hull and superstructure. The ammunition she was carrying provided several secondary explosions that accelerated her sinking, and within 20 minutes of our first attack pass, she had disappeared completely beneath the waves. The Japanese survivors in their lifeboats were subsequently picked up by one of our submarines, which was able to confirm that the ship had indeed been carrying military contraband in violation of her protected status. By February 1945, our ship-killing operations had become so successful that Japanese convoy activity in Philippine waters had virtually ceased. The few vessels that still attempted to make supply runs were usually single ships operating at night, and they rarely carried enough cargo to justify the fuel and ammunition costs of mounting major air operations against them. Our focus shifted to interdicting the small boats and barges that the Japanese were using for local transportation between islands, targets that required different tactics but were ultimately just as satisfying to eliminate. The final major convoy engagement of my tour occurred in early March, when intelligence detected a formation of 6 vessels attempting to evacuate Japanese personnel from Mindanao. The ships were a mixed bag: 2 destroyers, a light cruiser, and 3 transport vessels, and they were making good speed toward the northeast, apparently heading for Japanese-held territory in the Ryukyu Islands. We intercepted them about 50 miles southeast of Leyte, and the engagement that followed was notable for its intensity and duration. The Japanese had learned from previous encounters and were employing much more sophisticated defensive tactics, including coordinated evasive maneuvers and concentrated anti-aircraft fire. They had also chosen their route carefully, staying close enough to Japanese-held islands that they could potentially receive land-based air support if the engagement continued long enough. The battle lasted nearly 3 hours and involved 2 separate airstrikes totaling 24 aircraft. The Japanese fought with the desperation of men who knew they were facing their last chance to escape, and their defensive fire was the most accurate I had encountered during my entire tour. 3 of our aircraft took serious damage during the initial attack, and Ensign Martinez was forced to ditch about 10 miles from the engagement area after his engine was hit by anti-aircraft fire. But the outcome was never really in doubt. We had overwhelming superiority in numbers and firepower, and the Japanese ships were too far from friendly bases to receive meaningful support. One by one, they succumbed to our repeated attacks. The light cruiser was the first to go down, victim of a coordinated attack by 6 Hellcats that overwhelmed her defenses and started multiple fires throughout her superstructure. The transport vessels followed in quick succession, their thin hulls no match for our concentrated machine gun fire. The 2 destroyers lasted longest, using their speed and maneuverability to avoid our attacks for nearly an hour after the other ships had been sunk. But they were gradually worn down by our persistent pressure, taking hit after hit until their damage control capabilities were exceeded. The last destroyer to sink had been reduced to a barely floating wreck, her superstructure completely shot away and fires burning throughout her hull. But her crew continued to man their guns until the very end. When she finally rolled over and disappeared, I felt a genuine sense of professional admiration for the courage and seamanship her crew had displayed. The intelligence assessment of that final engagement confirmed that we had eliminated the last major Japanese naval force operating in Philippine waters. The 6 ships we had sunk represented virtually the entire remaining Japanese evacuation capability in the southern Philippines, and their destruction effectively trapped thousands of Japanese personnel on islands that were already under American control or would be within weeks. Looking back on those months of convoy hunting over the Philippine Islands, I realize now that we were witnessing the final collapse of Japanese naval power in the Western Pacific. Every ship we sent to the bottom represented not just a tactical victory, but a strategic step toward ending the war. The Japanese had begun the conflict with one of the world's most powerful navies, but by early 1945, they had been reducendo desperate attempts to supply their isolated garrisons with whatever vessels they could scrape together. Our ship-killing operations were part of a larger pattern of attrition that was slowly strangling the Japanese war effort. Without reliable sea transport, their armies couldn't be supplied or reinforced. Without fuel deliveries, their aircraft couldn't fly. Without raw materials, their factories couldn't produce weapons. We were methodically cutting the arteries that fed their war machine, and the results were becoming visible in every aspect of their military operations. The psychological impact on Japanese naval personnel must have been devastating. Every time they put to sea, they knew they were likely sailing to their deaths. Every convoy run was a potential suicide mission. Yet they continued to fight with a courage and determination that commanded respect, even from those of us who were doing our best to kill them. The professionalism and seamanship displayed by Japanese crews during those final months of the war was remarkable, particularly considering the hopelessness of their situation. From a technical standpoint, our success in the convoy interdiction campaign demonstrated the effectiveness of carrier-based aviation in sea control operations. The Hellcat had proven itself to be an ideal platform for ship attack missions, with enough firepower to damage or sink most vessel types and sufficient range and endurance to conduct extended patrol operations. Our tactics had evolved throughout the campaign, becoming increasingly sophisticated as we learned to coordinate multiple aircraft attacks and exploit the weaknesses of different ship types. But perhaps the most significant aspect of our ship-killing operations was their contribution to shortening the war. Every Japanese vessel we sent to the bottom meant fewer supplies reaching enemy forces, fewer reinforcements available for defensive operations, and less capability for Japanese commanders to conduct offensive actions. The cumulative effect of dozens of successful convoy attacks was a Japanese military that was increasingly isolated, undersupplied, and unable to maintain effective resistance. The final tally for our squadron alone was impressive: 78 confirmed ship sinkings over a 6-month period, ranging from major warships to small cargo vessels. When combined with the results achieved by other carrier air groups operating in Philippine waters, the total number of Japanese vessels destroyed during the campaign exceeded 300, representing a significant portion of Japan's remaining merchant marine and naval forces. As I flew my last convoy patrol in March 1945, scanning the empty horizons for targets that were no longer there, I couldn't help but reflect on the transformation that had taken place over the previous months. The Philippine waters that had once been crowded with Japanese shipping were now essentially an American lake, patrolled by our submarines and aircraft with impunity. The desperate convoy runs that had provided such exciting hunting in the early days of the campaign had become increasingly rare, and those few Japanese vessels that still ventured onto the open ocean rarely survived long enough to complete their missions. We had hunted them from the sky, systematically and relentlessly, until one by one they had all disappeared beneath the waves. The Japanese Navy that had attacked Pearl Harbor and conquered half the Pacific was gone, its scattered remnants hiding in harbors and coves, unable to venture onto the waters they had once controlled. It was a transformation that had taken years to accomplish and had cost thousands of lives on both sides, but it was finally complete. The war would continue for several more months, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Japan's ability to wage war beyond her home islands had been effectively eliminated, and the convoy interdiction campaign over the Philippines had played a crucial role in that achievement. Every ship we had sent to the bottom had brought the war one step closer to its inevitable conclusion, and that knowledge made all the danger and hardship of the campaign worthwhile. In the end, it wasn't just about the ships themselves, but about what they represented: Japan's connection to her overseas empire, her ability to project power across the Pacific, her capacity to sustain a war that had already lasted too long and cost too much. When the last convoy slipped beneath the waves in those Philippine waters, it marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new chapter in the history of naval warfare. We had proven that air power could control the seas as effectively as any battleship or submarine, and that lesson would reshape naval strategy for generations to come.